Hello again. It's me, and today let's explore a bizarre story that happened to me in 2008. At that time, I was living with my parents and younger sister in Brisbane, Australia. I was just 19 years old, and I felt a thrill recalling this experience as it truly terrified me back then. Although this story is quite well known among my friends, I've never shared it with anyone else. My dad had just installed Fox cable TV, but only the TV in the living room could connect to the cable box. I really wanted to watch cable TV in my room, but what I'm about to tell you made me never forget. We had a room without cable, so my dad went out and bought an AV transmitter receiver, a two-piece set of hardware. One part plugged into the cable television, while the other connected to the TV in my room. One Saturday, I decided to set it up. My younger sister, who was 16 at the time, was the only other person home. She was upstairs in her room while mine was downstairs. I opened the box and connected everything. At first, I struggled with getting the channels and cables right, but eventually, something started to fuzz on the screen. This is where things began to feel like a horror film. I thought, oh, here we go, and waited for the picture to focus. As it started to clear, I realized I hadn't even turned on the cable box in the lounge, which explained why it wasn't working. But then I wondered why I was still getting a signal. It hit me all at once. The cable box was off, yet the picture fuzzed in, revealing an image of a bed. I freaked out, thinking it was my bed. At the time, I had recently seen Saw 3, and I remembered a scene where a character turns on the television to find a camera filming her in her own apartment. That was the first thing I thought of. Terrified, I sprinted upstairs to my sister and told her to come down and take a look. She came down, and we both realized it wasn't my bed. We had no idea whose bed it was. It was obviously the AV receiver picking up a camera signal, but we were confused about who or what it belonged to. Eventually, my parents came home, and we concluded it must have been a neighbor or someone living nearby for us to be picking up that signal. We left the television on and waited until around 6 p.m. when someone came into the room. My dad recognized him as our next-door neighbor. We still didn't know what this camera was for, but we assumed it had something to do with infidelity. Maybe he or his wife had set it up to spy on the other. We entertained the idea that he was some kind of serial killer who filmed himself murdering people in his room, but that was just to freak each other out. We often joked about how one night we would turn it on and see his face with clown makeup staring into the camera, waving before exiting the bedroom with a knife in his hand. This never happened, but what did happen was still very unnerving. We connected to his signal for over a week. Although it felt a bit weird watching it at first, after a few days, the novelty wore off, and we were satisfied with the explanation that it was to catch his wife cheating. During this time, they were having some renovations done to their house, and contractors were there almost all day. It had been like this for over a month. One day, we turned it on and saw a man walk into the room. It was a plumber who had been there many times for the renovations. We didn't think much of it until he started opening the drawers. I called out to my mom, who was the only other person home at the time, and we started watching. He began taking out the wife's underwear and smelling them, doing all kinds of creepy stuff. At first, we were horrified, thinking, oh my God, what if the neighbors see this somehow? But what happened next was truly terrifying. He slowly made his way over to the camera and looked right down the lens. We were convinced he knew we were watching. My mom immediately called my dad while I kept watching. He started fiddling with the camera before putting it back down. I told my mom that I didn't think he knew we were watching, but he was definitely the one who had put that camera there. Eventually, my dad came home, and by that time, the plumber was gone. Much to my mom's pleading, my dad went over to the neighbors to tell them what we saw. My mom wanted to stay out of it and was understandably terrified. When he told the neighbors, they had no idea what we were talking about. They allowed my dad to go up to their room, where he discovered that what was holding the camera was a device in the wall designed to monitor water usage. This was completely normal at the time, as Brisbane was experiencing a drought and there were many water restrictions. The plumber had installed the device, but positioned the camera behind it to watch the bed. Immediately, they called the police, who came over and conducted an investigation. For the next week or so, we didn't hear much about it. I spent most of this time telling my friends about it and showing them pictures, but to be honest, my whole family was scared. Every night was creepy, thinking that we could have hidden cameras like that in our own house. Chances were we didn't, but it was unsettling nonetheless. After a couple of weeks, my mom talked to the neighbor's wife and asked what ended up happening. The wife said that the police discovered that, at night, the plumber would come to our street, sit in his car with tinted windows, and watch them from his laptop. When my mom told me this, I got the shivers. The natural creepiness of someone sitting in their car watching was terrifying, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of being violated. Our neighbors on a hidden camera feed I also remembered on multiple nights when I came back home late for my girlfriends, or walked home after a night out. I always remember seeing a station wagon parked down the street from our house. It was never there during the day. Always at night I would walk past it and see my reflection in the windows, assuming that nobody was inside. I was also confused by whose car it was, but I never thought anything nefarious was going on. But it still freaks me out, thinking that this creepy plumber was sitting in there spying on my neighbors and doing God knows what. At the time I found this all extremely disturbing, but it happened so long ago that me and my friends have a good laugh about it now. This story happened a very long time ago, and a lot of it I struggled to remember, so I had to get a lot of details from my mom before I wrote this about 11 years ago when I was 8 years old. My family and I, mom, dad, and my brother, as well as my brother's girlfriend who was living with us at the time, went on a holiday to Australia to visit some relatives on my mom's side of the family. They lived in a very rural part of Victoria. When facing the house on the left side, there were two wide open fields, and then at the far end of these fields was a heavily forested area with a dirt track running through it. My grandparents, the ones that lived here, would often go on hikes through the forest to see the wildlife. My mother, being a dedicated bird watcher, decided to head off into the forest with me and Lisa, my brother's girlfriend, as we both had a fascination with wildlife. We must have been walking on that dirt trail for around 10 minutes, taking pictures of the various animals we came across. We passed by a line of motorbikes and saw about 7 bikers having a barbecue. One of the bikers politely smiled at my mother, and she responded with a simple "a good evening." As we made our way past the group, one of the bikers approached us and asked where we were going. After we told him, he informed us that they had been camping in this area for around 2 nights and warned us to be careful as people had been having a shooting game in the forest. These people apparently also had aggressive dogs with them, so we were told to tread cautiously. About 15 minutes later, I spotted an old barn which I dashed off to explore. Being the adventurous child I was, Lisa and my mother were busy observing some kind of bird, and I didn't tell them where I was going. As I approached this barn, I saw 3 large dogs tied up outside. They were Rottweilers, and they seemed incredibly aggressive. They were on chains and were barking and snarling. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I assumed they were there for hunting, but looking back, Rottweilers aren't really hunting dogs. There was also an old mattress on the floor outside, which appeared to be covered in brown stains, and a foul smell emanated from it. I was around 3 feet away from the mattress, but the stench was unbelievably powerful. At this point, I changed my mind and was going to turn around when I saw someone emerging from the barn. The image of this man is one of the very few things I remember clearly to this day. He was very tall, around 6 feet 4 inches. The strangest thing about him, though, was that he was wearing a blue pinstriped suit and one of those large top hats. His clothes seemed very worn, and his face, the parts of it that weren't covered by a large beard, looked red, as if he had just got done working out in the hot sun all day. I remembered the man smiled as he approached me. I asked him if he was a magician, and he said, "No, mate, I just look after the doggies. Do you like doggies? This is where things start to get weird." He began to get closer and asked me if I wanted to come inside and have my picture taken with the dogs. I politely declined and said that my mom would be looking for me. He grabbed my arm lightly and said that it would only be a second. At that point, I heard my mom shout on, demanding to know what he was doing. The man simply let go of me and just stared at her. She asked him again what he was doing, in which he continued just to blankly stare. He didn't say a word. My mom immediately grabbed my arm, and we made her way back to the trail as quickly as possible. We got about halfway there when I turned around and told my mom that the magician was following us. She turned around, and sure enough, he was walking right behind us. My mom screamed at him and asked what the hell he was doing again. He didn't reply. He simply continued walking toward us. At that point, my mom began walking even faster, to the point where she was actually dragging me along. The next part of the story is mostly a blur to me. I remember my mom gasping, picking me up, and sprinting at full speed while screaming for help. My mom told me that the man had begun running toward us and managed to grab my leg. She said that Lisa jumped on the man's back and began scratching his face before he threw her off. While distracted, my mom took the opportunity to kick the man in the balls, got Lisa off the ground, and they took off down the trail with me over her shoulder. I remember that we slowed down shortly after and stopped briefly to catch our breath. We continued walking, but the magician would eventually show up again from a brush area. My mom began was a strange, charred smell in the air, and the ground was still slightly warm beneath our feet. As we stepped closer, I felt a chill run down my spine. The remnants of the caravan looked eerie against the vast, empty landscape, and the silence was almost deafening. My instincts were screaming that we shouldn't be there, but we had no choice. We needed answers. We cautiously approached the caravan, hoping to find something useful. My friend and I exchanged nervous glances, and I could see he was starting to feel the tension too. As we peered through the gaps in the walls, I could make out some old, burnt furniture and personal belongings scattered about. Clothes, a few singed toys, and what looked like remnants of a family's life. It felt like we were intruding on a tragedy that we couldn't fully understand. Suddenly, I noticed something shiny near the ground. As I bent down to get a better look, I realized it was a small, tarnished locket. I picked it up and opened it, only to find two pictures inside. One of a young girl with bright eyes and another of a man who looked eerily familiar. My heart raced as I recalled the face of the old man who had given us directions earlier. Could he have been connected to this? Just then, my friend shouted, snapping me back to reality. "Hey, come look at this." He was standing a few feet away, pointing towards the edge of the property. I walked over, and we both stared in disbelief at what appeared to be a makeshift grave marked by a wooden cross. The words were almost too faded to read, but I could make out the name Sophie. A sick feeling settled in my stomach, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over us. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. We both knew it was time to leave. Whatever had happened here was not our concern, and lingering any longer could be dangerous. I quickly stuffed the locket into my pocket as a strange urge to keep it tugged at me. It felt like a piece of the mystery we had stumbled into, something that tied us to this place, even if we didn't understand why. We rushed back to the car and started the engine, eager to escape the unsettling atmosphere. But as we turned the vehicle around, my heart dropped when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. An old man in khaki clothing, the same man who had given us directions. He was just standing there, watching us intently, his face expressionless. My friend shouted, "Drive now," as panic set in. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor kicking up dust as we sped away from the caravan. We didn't stop until we were back on the main highway, the darkness swallowing the dirt road behind us. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My thoughts swirled around the locket, the grave, and that old man. It was a mystery we had unwittingly become part of, and now I couldn't help but wonder what else lay hidden in that desolate stretch of the Australian outback. I had a strange compulsion to return, to dig deeper into what had happened there, but I knew we had been lucky to escape unscathed. We spent the rest of the trip talking about everything except that day, focusing on the sights, the adventures, anything to keep our minds off the unsettling encounter. Years later, that locket still sits on my dresser, a reminder of that day in the outback. I often wonder if that old man still roams the backroads, searching for something lost or perhaps watching over the remnants of a life that once was. And every time I see it, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine, as if the past is never truly buried and the stories of the forgotten still linger in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. The creak? It's a wild ride, mate. Just watch out for the kangaroos. They tend to hop out of nowhere around here. But nah, I get it, mate. It's all part of the charm. Just don't mind the old bones and the weird vibes. Everyone's just having a good time, right? But let's get back to the story. As I stood there, still processing what the woman had told me about that man and his fake motel, my stomach dropped. It was clear we had narrowly escaped something sinister. The image of the childlike voice, that eerie invitation to play, echoed in my mind. I felt sick to my stomach realizing we could have walked right into a trap. After getting enough gas to reach our destination, my friend and I climbed back into the X-Trail, our laughter from earlier now replaced with uneasy silence. We left the Dino Trail and headed back towards the town, our spirits dampened by the unsettling encounter. As we drove, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that car following us. The dusk settled in quickly, enveloping the outback in an eerie darkness. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my senses heightened as we navigated the winding roads. Every shadow seemed to twist into something menacing. Every rustle in the bushes felt like it could be something waiting to pounce. My friend, trying to lighten the mood, joked, "Maybe we just met the Outback's version of a horror movie cast. You know, the Bone Collector or something." But even his laughter fell flat against the backdrop of my growing dread. When we finally reached the town, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We pulled into a gas station and filled up, grateful to be surrounded by people and lights. But even in the safety of the gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had brushed up against something we shouldn't have. That old man, the child's voice, and the remnants of the burned caravan haunted my thoughts. Before we headed to our motel for the night, I made my friend promise that we wouldn't discuss the Moonlight Motel or the creepy directions we had received. We decided to keep our adventure lighthearted, at least as much as we could. We spent the evening recounting our dinosaur adventures, trying to push the disturbing memories to the back of our minds. But as I lay in bed that night, the shadows in the corners of the room felt particularly heavy. I kept imagining that locket resting on my dresser, the images of the girl and the man forever etched in my memory. When morning came, I thought about that encounter in the outback and the eerie vibes that lingered. As we prepared to head back home, I glanced at my friend and said, "You know, we really should tell someone about that creepy motel and that guy." But part of me wondered if some stories are better left untold, buried with the bones in the outback, and the ghosts of those who might have once played there. As we drove away, I made a mental note never to venture down a lonely dirt road again, especially not one marked by signs of the past that should have remained hidden. The outback had its secrets, and some of them were better left undisturbed. The story of Wolf's Creek has come to an end. In the deep shadows, where mysteries and fears await, one cannot help but wonder if there are other things lurking in the trees, waiting for a chance to return. Are you ready to confront those mysteries, or will you continue to live in fear? This video has come to an end. What do you think about this story? Don't hesitate to share your theories in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and now, goodbye and see you next time.